or a clear instruction from above. But what if the silence is the answer? What if the very absence of noise is a divine invitation to act? Faith, in its purest form, is not simply belief. It is movement. It is action taken in the absence of visible proof. Throughout history and spiritual tradition, we see this repeated truth. The moments that changed lives, nations, and destinies were not when people sat and waited for certainty, but when they acted despite uncertainty. Faith is rarely comfortable. It does not require full understanding or a predictable outcome. Instead, it demands that you move forward while the path is still unclear. The human tendency is to hesitate in the face of risk. We crave reassurance, details, guarantees. We want to know how things will unfold before we take the first step, but faith contradicts that impulse. It calls us to walk when we don't know where the road leads. It asks us to believe without seeing, and often to sacrifice without a visible reward. One of the core truths about spiritual growth is that it often begins where certainty ends. The most significant turning points in a believer's life are usually marked by decisions that felt risky, painful, or even irrational at the time. Yet these moments are where transformation happens. In many sacred narratives, the heroes didn't get a map, they got a word. And that word was enough. They didn't receive confirmation before acting. Confirmation came after obedience. This pattern is seen time and again. Divine instruction comes, and the individual is expected to respond without full context. That's the very essence of trust. To trust means to act without requiring full proof. If you have to see the outcome to obey, then you're not exercising faith. You're managing certainty. Many people get stuck because they wait for a sign that removes all risk. But divine wisdom doesn't usually operate that way. Often, the sign comes after movement. The sea doesn't part until the foot steps in. The provision doesn't fall until the journey begins. The strength doesn't appear until the weight is lifted. Movement triggers the miracle, and often the miracle isn't in the result, it's in the process. The moment you move, heaven responds. But without movement, you may stay in the same place for years, praying for breakthrough that's already waiting on your obedience. Faith that costs nothing is easy but weak. It doesn't grow muscle. It doesn't train trust. Real faith is forged in the fires of uncertainty, where each step forward is a battle against fear. And it's in that process that endurance is born. The decision to move forward, when staying still feels safer, is an act of spiritual maturity. It's an acknowledgement that comfort cannot be your God. When you learn to move even when it costs you something, your reputation, your pride, your expectations, you show heaven that your trust isn't conditional. You're not obeying for reward, you're obeying out of reverence. There's a subtle trap in waiting too long for confirmation. It can become spiritual procrastination. People may say they are waiting on God, but often God is waiting on them. Waiting becomes a shield for fear, a cover for passivity. There is a time for discernment, yes, but there is also a time for action. And if you never reach the point of movement, your faith remains theory instead of practice. Faith that doesn't move you is merely thought. But faith that pushes you forward, despite cost, is alive, it's dynamic, it breathes, it grows. Moreover, when you move in faith, you begin to experience divine partnership. It's not that you walk alone into uncertainty, it's that your step activates divine alignment. Resources meet you, people show up, inner strength rises, things shift, not always immediately, not always dramatically, but gradually, unmistakably, the evidence of movement in faith begins to reveal itself. The very act of moving becomes a catalyst for what comes next. You may not see it at first, but you sense that something has changed within and around you. That's not coincidence. That's divine response. The reality is, faith will cost you, but so will fear. The difference is that faith brings growth, while fear brings regret. The cost of faith might be temporary discomfort, but the cost of fear is missed opportunity and spiritual stagnation. Those who choose to move, even when it hurts, become vessels for greater purpose. They become examples of what trust looks like when feelings are uncertain, when the outcome is unclear, and when the journey is lonely. And yet, those same individuals often look back and realize the cost was worth it, because in the process, they didn't just see external change, they became different themselves. One of the most fundamental lessons in spiritual maturity is learning to separate truth from emotion. Feelings are real, but they are not always accurate indicators of divine presence or purpose. Many people interpret difficult seasons as signs of abandonment, assuming that hardship must mean God is distant. But this perspective is emotionally driven, not theologically sound. God's reliability is not subject to mood swings, environmental shifts, or personal perceptions. His character is not up for debate each time our circumstances fluctuate. This is where many falter, not because God has changed, but because their perspective of him was too rooted in comfort. Human experience often associates consistency with predictability. We think something or someone is reliable if they act in the same way every time. So, when God allows surprises, delays, or detours, we start to question his faithfulness. But divine consistency does not mean predictability. It means trustworthiness. God is consistent in nature, not always in method. He is always loving, always just, always wise, but he is not bound to operate the same way twice. The way he provided last year may not be how he provides now. The door he opened for someone else may remain closed for you, for a reason you cannot yet see. But none of this negates his reliability. The challenge is that emotions often speak louder than truth in moments of uncertainty. When fear rises, when anxiety creeps in, when things seem to fall apart, it's easy to question everything. We may feel forgotten, invisible, or even punished. But faith is not a denial of emotion. It is the discipline of not letting emotion dictate what we believe about God. Feelings fluctuate, but truth does not. Anchoring your trust in God's unchanging character is what sustains you when circumstances contradict your expectations. There's a psychological tendency in humans to equate ease with favor and struggle with disapproval. But many times, the deepest spiritual growth happens in the silence of difficulty. God's faithfulness is often most visible in hindsight. It's when you look back on the season you barely survived that you realize how you were carried through. You may not have seen divine activity in real time, but you later recognize divine preservation. This is crucial. God is not only present in the miracle moments, he is present in the sustaining moments. The times when you didn't fall apart, when you made it through what should have broken you, are powerful testimonies of his presence, even when you didn't feel it. God's reliability must be taught, internalized, and revisited continually, especially during trials. It's not enough to have a surface-level belief that God is good when things are going well. That belief must be rooted deep enough to withstand loss, delay, disappointment, and uncertainty. There is a spiritual discipline in choosing to remember the track record of God's provision and faithfulness, especially when your current season gives no visible sign of either. What has been true before will remain true again, not because you feel it, but because God's nature does not shift with the wind. There is also a danger in making theology out of temporary pain. Just because something is hard does not mean it is wrong. Just because you feel disconnected doesn't mean you are abandoned. Silence is not absence. Delay is not denial, and confusion is not failure. Often, the very seasons that seem the most disorienting are the ones preparing you for deeper clarity. God is not committed to your comfort. He is committed to your transformation, and transformation rarely happens in predictable, easy conditions. In fact, the very act of holding on to trust in the face of contradiction is what strengthens faith. When you no longer require constant emotional reassurance to remain loyal to God, that's when you begin to walk in maturity. It's like learning to drive without a GPS. You may not hear instructions every mile, but that doesn't mean you've taken a wrong turn. Silence may be a sign that you're exactly where you need to be. This requires a paradigm shift, trusting that God's silence is sometimes a form of communication in itself, a test of endurance, and a call to remember what he already said. God's reliability is one of the most stabilizing truths a person can live by. It anchors the soul when life is chaotic. It acts as a compass when direction is unclear. It becomes the bedrock when everything else is shaking. To believe in his reliability is to say, even when I do not see the outcome, I trust the character of the one who holds it. This is not blind optimism, it's informed faith. It is the result of learning, through repeated experience, that God is not faithful because we feel it. He is faithful because that is who he is. Obedience that costs you nothing isn't obedience, it's convenience. Real obedience is most authentic when it comes with sacrifice. The notion that following God should always feel good or fit comfortably into our personal plans is not only inaccurate, it is spiritually dangerous. Costly obedience reveals the depth of trust you have in God's voice, not just his blessings. It's easy to obey when the path is clear and the rewards are immediate. But what about when obedience asks you to release something you love, step into uncertainty, or endure ridicule for your convictions? That's when the true measure of trust is revealed, not by what you gain, but by what you're willing to give up. Costly obedience often feels counterintuitive. It asks you to stay when you want to leave, to speak when you'd rather be silent, to give when it feels like you're running low, to forgive when the wound still stings. It does not follow the logic of comfort or self-preservation, and that's why it's so powerful, because it requires surrender. To obey when it hurts means you are trusting God more than your feelings, more than your need for control, and more than your desire for validation. Obedience becomes more than an action, it becomes worship. It's saying, you are worth this cost. I trust you with what I cannot understand. One of the most misunderstood aspects of spiritual growth is the belief that hardship means misdirection. But the truth is that sometimes the most difficult path is the most obedient one. Jesus himself modeled this when he chose the cross. His obedience was not easy, but it was essential, and it was costly, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Yet, through that obedience came redemption. This teaches us a fundamental principle. Obedience is not about outcome first, it's about alignment. You can't always predict what will happen after you obey, but the act of obedience places you under divine alignment, where God can work through your surrender. Obedience also isolates sometimes. People may not understand your decisions. You may be mocked, misjudged, or misunderstood. There's a lonely weight to choosing obedience in a culture that values compromise and convenience. You might walk away from lucrative opportunities, unhealthy relationships, or habits that once gave you comfort, but that cost is not in vain. Every act of costly obedience shapes your character, clarifies your values, and strengthens your spirit. It teaches you to trust in the unseen and to walk not by sight, but by faith. Obedience becomes a mirror showing how much you actually believe what you say you believe. Furthermore, costly obedience isn't just about the moment. It's about the ripple effects it creates. One decision to obey can influence generations. One private sacrifice can birth public impact. The story of Abraham is a classic example. His willingness to obey, even when asked to offer up what was most precious to him, positioned him as the father of nations. He didn't understand the outcome at the moment, but he trusted the one who asked. This teaches us that God honors obedience not just in the outcome, but in the posture of the heart. It is the willingness, not just the success, that matters. Another critical dimension of costly obedience is the internal wrestling it causes. Obedience doesn't mean the absence of fear or doubt. It means choosing truth in the presence of them. There are moments when you will obey while trembling. You will say yes through tears. You will walk forward with shaking legs. That is not weakness, that is courage, and heaven recognizes that kind of obedience. It's not about emotional certainty. It's about spiritual conviction. It's about saying, even if this costs me, I'd rather be in the will of God than outside of it trying to protect myself. What makes costly obedience so transformational is that it draws you closer to the heart of God. When you give up something for Him, you begin to experience a deeper intimacy with Him. Your dependence increases, your prayer life deepens, and your sensitivity to His voice becomes sharper. Obedience purifies. It strips away distractions, it breaks pride, it reveals motives, and in that refining process, you don't just change your behavior. You are changed entirely. You become more like the one you're following. Ultimately, costly obedience teaches that God's approval is more valuable than man's applause. It shifts your reward system. You stop measuring success by comfort or outcomes, and you start measuring it by alignment and faithfulness. That is a mark of spiritual maturity, when you value obedience for its own sake, not for what it gives you. You obey because you trust. You trust because you know who He is, and even when the cost is high, you believe that He is worth it. Conviction is the internal compass that anchors your soul when the external world is spinning. It is not based on how you feel, what people say, or what circumstances suggest. Conviction is rooted in deeply held truth, truth that does not change even when everything else does. In seasons of chaos, when life becomes uncertain and unpredictable, conviction becomes a lifeline. While emotion reacts to chaos, conviction stands firm in it. It reminds you of what you know when everything around you tries to make you doubt. Conviction doesn't remove the storm, it holds you steady within it. The true strength of conviction is revealed when it's tested. Anyone can declare faith, purpose, or values in calm conditions. But it's when things fall apart, when plans collapse, when opposition rises, and when hope seems distant, that conviction proves whether it's just a belief or a foundation. Chaos has a way of pressing against everything you thought you knew. It raises questions like, did I hear God right? Should I have chosen differently? Or is this even worth it? Yet conviction answers those questions with quiet consistency. It doesn't always silence the storm, but it silences the panic. It reminds you that you didn't come this far on a feeling, you came on a calling. Conviction that stays through chaos is what separates temporary passion from long-term purpose. Passion can fade when pressure increases. Emotions fluctuate with the environment, but conviction is built on truth, not trends. It's what keeps you praying when there are no answers. It's what keeps you committed when the outcome is unclear. It's what keeps you showing up, speaking truth, staying faithful, and holding your ground even when you're misunderstood, overlooked, or attacked. Without conviction, chaos becomes louder than your calling. With it, your calling speaks louder than the chaos. Chaos often brings confusion, distraction, and discouragement. These are weapons meant to shift your focus, weaken your resolve, and derail your obedience. But conviction cuts through the noise. It brings clarity where there is confusion. It reminds you of the original instruction when everything else is pulling you in a different direction. It narrows your vision. In chaotic seasons, people often become desperate for signs, shortcuts, or easier routes. But conviction keeps you aligned with what is right, not just what is easy. It keeps your decisions rooted in integrity, even when compromise seems tempting. That's because conviction values long-term obedience over short-term relief. Conviction also creates resilience. It doesn't remove pain, but it helps you endure it. When the world shakes, conviction becomes your unshakable center. It's what allows people to endure suffering without losing faith, to walk through loss without losing hope, and to confront resistance without retreating. This doesn't mean the chaos doesn't affect you emotionally. It simply means you don't let it redefine your identity or your direction. Conviction allows grief without bitterness, disappointment without disobedience, and struggle without surrender. One of the most beautiful truths about conviction is that it often grows stronger in crisis. The very storms that try to uproot you are often the ones that deepen your roots. You learn what you truly believe when believing costs you something. You learn what you're truly committed to when quitting feels easier. You discover the depth of your spiritual conviction when comfort, clarity, and applause are stripped away. What's left in those moments is something raw, unfiltered, and incredibly powerful. A faith that no longer needs external validation to survive. Conviction also provides direction. In seasons where everything feels chaotic, it's easy to lose your sense of purpose. Conviction keeps you from drifting. It keeps you tethered to your assignment, your values, and your identity. Even when the steps aren't clear, conviction tells you which way not to go. That in itself is a gift. Sometimes God doesn't give new instructions during chaos because He's already spoken. Conviction remembers what was spoken in the light and holds on to it in the dark. It doesn't chase every voice, it listens for the voice. Conviction is also contagious. When people see someone standing firm in a chaotic world, it draws attention. It becomes a testimony, a living example of strength that doesn't come from circumstances, but from within. People wonder how you're still standing, still believing, still showing up. And the answer is not charisma or optimism, it's conviction. It's the unwavering inner alignment with truth that cannot be shaken by what's happening around you. Conviction is not arrogance, it is anchored humility. It says, I don't have all the answers, but I know who I trust. And finally, conviction that survives chaos often becomes clarity after it. Many people realize only later that the chaos was not meant to destroy them. It was meant to refine them. It clarified what really mattered. It revealed hidden strength. It burned away distractions. Conviction carried them through the fire, and they emerged with a deeper understanding of who they are and who God is. What remained was purer, stronger, and more unshakable than before. That is the gift of conviction. It survives what your feelings can't. When facing uncertainty, the human mind naturally gravitates toward fear and doubt. It imagines the worst, case scenarios, and questions whether the path ahead will work out. This is where the power of memory becomes essential. Not just memory of personal experience, but memory of divine faithfulness. God's track record, His proven history of showing up, providing, healing, guiding, and sustaining, becomes the strongest argument against fear and discouragement. What He has done before is not just a comforting story. It is a foundation for trust in what He will do again. Remembering God's past faithfulness is not an emotional exercise. It is a spiritual discipline. In Scripture, God constantly instructed His people to remember, not because He needed the reminder, but because they did. Human beings are forgetful, especially in crisis. When pressure increases, we often suffer from spiritual amnesia. We forget how we were delivered the last time. We forget how God opened the door we didn't expect, made a way when we had none, and brought peace when we were falling apart. The problem is not that God is inconsistent. It's that we stop rehearsing His consistency. Every breakthrough you've experienced is a reference point. Every time you thought it was over, but it wasn't, becomes proof that God's hand was working behind the scenes. These reference points aren't just memories, they are evidence. When facing a new trial, the enemy wants you to focus on the unknown. But faith redirects your attention to what is already known. God has never failed you. He may not have moved in the way you expected or on the timeline you hoped for, but He has always been faithful to complete what He started. This is why journaling, testifying, or simply recalling answered prayers are more than spiritual practices. They are tools of warfare. When anxiety about the future tries to dominate your thinking, the antidote is remembrance. You speak to your soul, just like the psalmist did. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Hope in God. That hope isn't wishful thinking. It's informed faith based on a track record. You don't have to invent hope. You recall it. What God did last year, 5 years ago, or even in someone else's life, becomes ammunition for trust. God's track record isn't limited to dramatic miracles. It includes the daily sustenance, the quiet provision, the undeserved favor, and the peace that passed understanding. Too often, people overlook these moments because they seem small. But when you zoom out, you realize those small provisions created a pattern of divine involvement. And patterns reveal consistency. If God showed up then and then again and again, why would He stop now? The past becomes the blueprint of trust. Another layer of God's track record is found in Scripture. The Bible isn't just a book of ancient stories, it's a living document of divine reliability. From Noah to Moses, from Esther to Paul, the thread is the same. God shows up, God preserves, God provides. God keeps His word. When you saturate your mind with these truths, they begin to replace the anxious narratives in your head. You don't just hope God will be faithful, you expect Him to be, because He always has been. God's consistency is one of His defining characteristics. He doesn't promise one thing and deliver another. He doesn't begin something in your life and leave it unfinished. The book of Philippians reminds us, He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. That's not motivational fluff, it's divine assurance. His record speaks for itself. And when you trust in His record, you no longer make decisions based on fear of failure. You make decisions based on a history of faithfulness. One of the reasons people hesitate to move forward in faith is because they are more familiar with their fear than with God's history. Fear is loud, urgent, and emotional, but remembrance is quiet, steady, and rooted. To build your faith, you must familiarize yourself with how God has moved in your past. You must treat memory as evidence, not nostalgia. Each step forward then becomes an extension of trust, not a gamble. You are not stepping into darkness. You are walking with the one who has proven Himself over and over again. Even when you're walking through a situation you've never faced before, you can rely on a God you've already experienced. The context may be new, but His character is the same. The test may look different, but the one who sustained you through the last one is still with you. You don't need every detail to fall into place right now. You need to remember that the same God who walked you through the valley is the same God who will bring you through this too. That history is not just comforting, it's empowering.